I love the tagline to the series, stress, exhaustion, and what on earth we can do about it. Getting ready for this morning, I tried to think about what have been the most exhausting moments of my life. What have been the most exhausting seasons of my life? If you took a time or a few moments to think about that, you probably could come up with that pretty easily. For me, my memory took me back really distinctly to about 11 years ago, the first time I ever flew through the night. Has anybody ever done this before? You've flown through the night somewhere? Yes, several of us. I don't recommend it. It's a one and done experience for me. You may not know me personally, but you can just take a look at me and go, yeah, he doesn't sleep well on planes. I don't sleep well in a Toyota Sequoia, let alone an airplane. But I was flying through the night on this international flight, and any of us who have done this before, you want the window seat. That's first priority. If you can't get the window seat, you want the aisle seat, right? Especially if you're 6'4" like me, you can stretch out a little bit, lean back, you can get a little rest. You don't want the middle seat. We can all agree on that. I see some people nodding. If you're a middle seat person, please don't come tell me that after the service. I won't be able to hear anything you say after that because I won't believe you. But I, as luck would have it, I got the middle seat on this flight. Not only was it the middle seat, but it was the middle section of seats in the middle of this plane. And I remember getting off the flight the next morning and just the amount of fatigue that I felt. I remember going, man, I've been tired before, but this must be what exhaustion feels like. And some of you have been there. You know what that is like. But that's kind of like physical exhaustion, and we can bounce back from that pretty quickly. A couple years after that, I was introduced to a new kind of exhaustion. I got a job where a big component of my job was in sales. And some of you are in that type of world right now where the performance that you can pull off at your workplace, it greatly impacts the bottom line of your company. And if you don't meet your deadlines, if you don't meet the quota or you don't reach the goal that you're trying to reach, it greatly impacts the company's success. And I was in a season like that. And I remember going home at the end of the day and not really being able to turn that off in my mind. Just the amount of pressure that I was under. And there were times where I would go home on the weekend and I wouldn't be able to think about anything else other than that all weekend. And I remember just feeling so tired during that season. And what I think I was understanding for the first time was there's a mental exhaustion as well. And then I was introduced a few years after that to emotional exhaustion because I became a parent. And when you're a parent or any kind of caregiver, if you have an aging parent or there's a relationship in your life that just needs you constantly, you know just as much as I do that your emotions are just pulled like a rubber band and you oscillate between these extremes, and at the end of the day, you feel kind of numb. It's because you're emotionally exhausted. And what happens is when we go through this physical exhaustion and this mental exhaustion, this emotional exhaustion, we often think that these are standalone things that we can kind of medicate and approach on their own, but you know just as much as I do that all of this is connected. And when the expectations of your life outgrow whatever it is that's in you that you feel like you can respond to your life, that's when we get right up on the edge or all the way over into burnout. And we're calling this series The Burnout Society. If you're just joining us, this is part 2. And the reason that we're calling it the Burnout Society is because burnout is not just for a small number of jobs anymore. It's not just for a few seasons of life that you kind of power through and you get through it. No, burnout is the society that we live in. You've experienced burnout probably like I have, or had a relationship close to you experience burnout, and as a result, it's impacted you. And Josh kicked us off last week with a couple of really big ideas, and the first one is that if we live in a world where burnout is so normal that we can actually call it the burnout society and agree with that, like, yeah, that makes sense, then maybe what we call normal isn't working anymore. And he said this, he gave us this really helpful definition of burnout. He said, burnout is when your soul can no longer bear the weight of your life. When you are in that place, when you are living in a structure or you're living in a rhythm of life where the thing in you, that soul that you have, that deep place inside of you where your emotions live and your mind and your will, if those things can no longer bear the weight of your life, then you are right on the edge, or you might already be over into burnout. None of us really need convincing of that. But I do think it's helpful if we all got on the same page a little bit this morning and just try to answer the question, how did we get here? Like, how is this normal now? And I think the explanation can be actually, it's easy to understand, but it's also really easy to forget. A few weeks ago, I was reminded of this. I went down to the Gulf with my family for spring break. And being out in the ocean for the first time this year, I was reminded that in the ocean, there is a powerful current at play all the time. And it's moving you and it's shifting you and it's trying to kind of knock you off balance. And you're not doing anything major out there in the water. You're hanging out, you're floating around. But if you don't pay attention, you can look up and you're 10, 20, 30, maybe even more yards down the beach from where you started from, wherever your umbrella, your tent is. And that's why when you're a kid, you're taught, hey, when you're swimming in the ocean, you need to pick a reference point. And that way you can kind of gauge where you are and make your way back. But in the world we live in, there are powerful currents as well. There's a culture that's constantly moving us and trying to shift us and direct us in directions. And we're not trying to do anything major, we're just existing. But there's a powerful current. And in life, just like when you are in the ocean, in life, we also pick reference points. It might not be as obvious, it actually is a little bit more subtle, but in life, oftentimes what we do is we pick reference points that are based on other people or what's happening around us. And there's no guilt or shame in that. I do the same thing. Why do we do that? It's because it's what's in front of us. It's what we see. But here's the problem with that, is that if we're living in a world with a really powerful cultural drift, and we're choosing reference points that are also changing, then it makes a lot of sense how it can be so easy to veer into a rhythm of life or a pace of life or an approach to life that's just really chaotic. And when we live in that chaos for too long, it actually starts to do damage on your soul. When we live in that place for too long, it does damage on your soul. And so we got to get on the same page about, well, if that's the problem, then what's the solution? Well, I think the solution is also pretty easy to understand. If you were to go to a friend or a wise counsel in your life and say, hey, this is what I'm going through. This is kind of the condition of my life. Here's the pace at which I'm living. What do you think I should do? At some point in their response, probably they're going to say, hey, I think you need to get some rest. And so what we all want is rest. And when you see that word on the screen, there's a couple of things that happen in you and in me. First of all, when you see that word rest, or when you hear that word rest, especially in the middle of a burnout society, is something in you kind of wakes up a little bit. And there's something in you that goes, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I crave. I crave rest. But in reality, when we see that word, we are probably misinterpreting. If you're anything like me, you're misinterpreting what that word really is. And when we see the word rest or we hear about rest, what we are thinking is, I just need a break. I need some relief. I need a break from my life. And there's nothing wrong with getting a break every now and then, but you know this as much as I do. If your life is chaotic and then you take a break, what do you come back to? Another chaotic life. Nothing changed. You just took a break. And I think there's something more that we want there. I think rest is actually getting at something deeper. And so rest, true, it is what we all want, and I think rest is part of it, but what we really want is restoration. Because that chaos, that pace of life that has broken something inside of you and broken something inside of me, that thing in us that craves rest, what it really wants is restoration. Because restoration can heal and it can make us whole again. And the good news this morning is that your heavenly Father, who loves you so much, sent his only Son to show you what he is like. Jesus Christ, he said this when he was on this earth. He said in Matthew chapter 11, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He goes on. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's what Jesus offers you. It's what he offers me. And we see that up on the screen, or we've read that before, or maybe you grew up in church, you've heard that before. Maybe this is your first Sunday in church in a long time, and you see that and you go, yeah, that is what I want. And I'm thankful that someone's trying to give that to me, especially Jesus Christ is trying to give that to me. But Stephen, I don't think you understand. My life is so chaotic, I don't even know if I can experience that. Even if someone were to hand that to me, I don't even know if I could take it. I've been too busy. I've been running too fast. My life has been chaotic for too long. I've been in burnout for too long. I don't know if I can experience that. And I would say, if that's you, I don't fault you for thinking that way. Because all of us have been fed a lie for so long, and this is something we've all bought into, something I've bought into as well. And the myth or the lie, it says this. It says, rest happens when the work is done. The myth is that rest happens when the work is done. And you see that and you go, well, duh. Of course. I've got to work until it's complete, then I can rest. And I would just ask you just gently, I would just say, is the work ever done? Because in my life, and probably in your life, when you finish whatever you're doing at the office, you go home and there's work waiting on you at home. I mean, when you're done mowing the yard, then you've got to pay the bills. When you're done at the office, then you've got the laundry at home. When you cook dinner, then you've got to clean up after dinner. And I would just say this, hey, maybe the work doesn't stop. And so the truth that I think God is inviting us to consider this morning is that work doesn't stop. So maybe we have to. Work doesn't stop, so maybe we have to. But here's the thing. We don't like to stop, do we? We don't like to slow down, let alone stop completely, because we are so addicted to productivity. We're so addicted to progress. We're so addicted to efficiency. And it's like our value is so wrapped up in what we do and how good we do it. And I absolutely understand that. And the good news this morning, the encouraging thing this morning is that there's actually something we're compared to in the scriptures that shares this same characteristic, this aversion that you and I have to rest, or maybe this confusion around, hey, I don't even know how to do it or what that would look like. I definitely don't want to stop because that feels a little scary or whatever it might be. There's something we're compared to in the scriptures over 500 times. And we share the same characteristic with this thing, just like what we're saying, and it's this lovable creature right here, it's the sheep. Over 500 times. We're compared to sheep. If you are a Jesus follower, if you believe in God, you follow God, then the scriptures are full of comparisons to us as sheep and God as our shepherd. And so what I want to do this morning is I actually want to look at a passage in the Old Testament where this imagery is fully on display, where we are compared to sheep and God is compared to a shepherd. And there's so much I think we can learn from this. Specifically, I think that God wants to teach us a little bit about rest, why we have such an aversion to it, why it's so hard. And then also, is there something he invites us into that helps us enter his rest on a consistent basis? So that's what we're going to do today. If you've got your Bible, I want you to turn to Psalm 23. Psalm 23, everybody. If you have your phone and your device, you want to pull that up, you can. But Psalm 23, just a little bit of context. This is arguably the most famous passage when it comes to the sheep imagery and sheep and shepherd. And David, who wrote this psalm, essentially he's writing in his journal one day. And he's trying to decide, like, how do I describe God? What is God like? And who am I in relation to him? How does that work? Well, David grew up as a shepherd. The story that we read in the Old Testament where David was anointed as king, he has to be called in from the fields off of tending the flocks of his father, the sheep of his family. And so David knew a great deal about this relationship, and there's so much here that we can learn. I just want to unpack the first couple of sentences. So Psalm 23, verse 1, it says this, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want." Some translations say, "I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul." I want to read it one more time. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul." So there it is. There's the restoration that we all want. We read verse 3 and we go, yeah, that's the thing in me that just kind of bubbles up a little bit. That's the thing in me that my soul is craving, is that God would restore my soul. And we want the restoration that happens in verse 3. We don't want what happens in verse 2, which is he makes me lie down. And so the first thing I want to highlight out of this passage for us is that restoration begins with rest. Restoration begins with rest. And there's so much going on here because of the sheep imagery and because of this comparison that so many of us miss, because we didn't grow up in as fully an agrarian society or as shepherds or sheep. And I'm actually going to take a risk here. Is there anybody here who is actually a modern day shepherd? Like you run a sheep farm? I think I saw one hand. You can just tune out for the next 5 minutes, but all the rest of us. There's a book a few years ago that I read called A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And it's written by a guy named Philip Keller. And Philip Keller is a modern day shepherd, another part of the world. And he's saying, hey, for modern audiences, there is so much in this psalm that we might miss because we don't understand the dynamic of raising sheep or being around sheep. And this passage, this verse 2 where he says, he makes me lie down. My whole life I've been curious, why did David say that? Is it because God is a forceful God? I don't think that's true. So what's going on here? Well, Keller would say this. He would say, the strange thing about sheep is that because of their very makeup, it is almost impossible for them to be made to lie down unless 4 requirements are met. For a sheep to lie down, there's got to be 4 things that are true, 4 things that are met, 4 requirements that are satisfied before they will ever stop and rest. And here's what they are. A sheep must be free from all fear, tension, aggravation, and hunger. In order for sheep to lie down, they've got to be completely free from all fear, all tension, all aggravation, all hunger. And I want to leave that list up there for a second. Do you have any of that in your life right now? Do you have any fear? Fear of missing out, like Josh talked about last week? Fear of the future, fear of the unknown? Do you have any tension in your life? A relationship that's tense, aggravation, maybe a decision you made in the past that's aggravating you, or something that happened to you that's aggravating you? Or maybe there's a hunger of some kind. It's not physical hunger, but there's something deep in you and you've been trying to satisfy this thing in you that's been hungry your whole life, and you've looked the whole earth over and you haven't been satisfied. And I just want to say, might be why you're here today. We see that list and we go, okay, fear, tension, aggravation, hunger. All right, I just need to remove all these things from my life and then I'll be able to rest. That's all I need to do. I just need to get rid of this stuff and then I'll be able to lie down. I'll be able to stop. And Keller would say, no, you don't understand sheep. Sheep are helpless creatures. If there's a threat in the pasture, they can't do anything about it. They just run scared. If there's tension among them, if there's something aggravating them, there's bugs or pests or whatever it might be, they cannot do anything about it. And Keller says there's only one thing that satisfies all 4 of these requirements. And it's this. It's the presence of the shepherd. It's the presence of the shepherd. He's the one that can remove the threat. He's the one that can remove the fear. He's the one that can remove the tension, the aggravation. He's the one that brings the sheep to a place where their hunger can be satisfied. And you and I, we spend our lives thinking that rest might be the absence of something. It's the absence of work. It's the absence of fear. It's the absence of all the tension in my life. Once I can get rid of all that, then I can lie down. Then I can rest. Then I can stop. And Keller and David is trying to tell us through this psalm, he's going, no. Rest isn't the absence of something. It's the presence of someone. It's not the absence of what you think. It's the presence of someone, and that someone is the Lord. And years would go by, and a Jewish rabbi would show up on the pages of history, and he would say, hey, you've read all about this shepherd? You've heard about this shepherd? Well, I am the good shepherd. So the bottom line this morning is this: when I stop striving, he starts restoring. When you and I stop striving, that's when he starts restoring. And it's this deep level rest that brings about healing and can make us whole again, even in the middle of a burnout society. The presence of the shepherd can bring you rest. And the question naturally would come at that point, how do I do that? Is there anything that God invites us into that would enable me to enter this kind of rest or have a rhythm of this where I'm aware of it at all times? Because it's so easy for us to get distracted from this truth. And yes, there is. There's something that God introduced to the Israelite people way back in Exodus chapter 20 that you see all through the Old Testament and you see as a pattern in the life of Christ himself. And it's the ancient idea of this, Sabbath. Sabbath. Now, if you grew up around church or you grew up in church, this is a word maybe you're familiar with, maybe you've never heard it before. But I want to talk to you about Sabbath for a second, because in the last 2 or 3 years, this is arguably the number one spiritual rhythm or practice or discipline, whatever you want to call it, that has impacted my life the most. And so Sabbath, it's a Hebrew word, Shabbat, that means to stop or to cease, to be quiet or be still. So what are we stopping when we say that? Well, you're stopping all the work you get paid for and all the work you don't get paid for, because there is both. And it's taking one day out of your week to stop all the work you get paid for and all the work you don't get paid for. Now, why did God initiate this and introduce this to the Israelite people? Well, think about it. In Exodus chapter 20, he's giving the Israelite people this new way of life. Because for the previous 400 years, the Israelite people had been slaves in Egypt. And God says, I want you to take one day out of your week to stop everything you're doing. And there's so many reasons why God introduced the Sabbath, but there's a couple that I think are so easy for you and I to understand today of how it can apply and help us even in modern times. And I think God introduced the Sabbath because he wanted the Israelite people to remember their true identity. Because for 400 years, what had their identity been? Work. I mean, imagine their life, their parents' life, their grandparents' life, their great-grandparents' life. The only thing they knew was work. And God's saying, I want you to take one day, 24 hours out of your week, and remember that's not who you are anymore. You belong to me now. I'm your God, you are my people, and that's not your identity, that's not your value anymore. On top of that, I think he wanted the Israelite people to remember their limits. And we live in a world where we can go beyond our limits because of technology and advances in so many ways. But I think you and I both know that even in modern times, we have a physical and emotional, a mental tank that gets depleted over time. And I think God's saying, I want you to stop for one day out of your week of all the work you get paid for and all the work you don't get paid for. And remember that you have a limit. And you know what this does? Is it reminds us that God is able more than we are capable. It's a reminder that God is able more than we are capable. And so how does this look in our life? If you're like me and you grew up in church and maybe you've heard the word Sabbath, there's seasons in my life where honestly the Sabbath, it sounded miserable because I thought it was like a 24-hour quiet time where I need to go to church all day or I'm gonna pray all day, and that honestly doesn't sound like a lot of fun. And some of you are like nodding your head going, yeah, ever since you put Sabbath up there, that's all I've been thinking about. But the more I study this idea and the more God's shown me this over the last couple of years, Sabbath is more about delight than anything. Think in your life right now. There's a handful of things probably you would say, hey, when I spend time with this person, when I go and do that with my family, when I invest time in this activity, whatever that is for you, it's probably a handful of things. I just feel more full when that's over. I feel like I'm restored a little bit. Have you ever considered that might be a gift from God to you to help your soul be restored? When you start to see the things in your life as everything being a gift from him, it's an absolute game changer. James, the brother of Jesus, he says this. He says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. When you start to see the things in your life that give you life as gifts from your Creator to help orient your life and your heart back to him, it's a total game changer. The Sabbath is an invitation to fill your day with those things. That's what it is. Ronald Rolheiser, he says this, the highest compliment we can give a gift giver is to enjoy the gift thoroughly. As God has given us this life and given us these things and given us these practices and rhythms to orient our life back to him, to enjoy those things is the greatest act we could do. And so I want to just briefly invite you into my life for a second and tell you, in the last few years, this is how my family has practiced Sabbath. We don't have any hard and fast rules around it. We have more guidelines than anything. But here are some of our guidelines. Obviously, there's no work, email, there's no work text, there's no sermon prep for me on Saturday. I try to wrap that all up by Thursday or Friday. But what we do have is we have some guidelines, and a couple of those guidelines are this. One guideline is we try to prioritize slow mornings and slow evenings. That's the phrase. Slow mornings and slow evenings. What does that mean? That means for so many days a week, we're rushing out of the house. What would it look like for one day of the week we didn't do that? How would we need to plan our schedule so that we don't rush out? And part of that is I cook breakfast on Saturday mornings. It helps us slow down. It's not a grab and go kind of breakfast. We cook breakfast. And the same thing in the evenings, slow evenings. How do we make that an ease into the night instead of something we're rushing into and hurrying into? The second guideline we have is probably my favorite one, is we eat really well. We eat really well. I don't mean we're eating salad every meal. I mean, it usually involves queso. Because on Friday night, our Sabbath is from Friday dinner to Saturday dinner. And we put the kids down on Friday night, and then I go out and get some takeout and come back. And yes, it does involve queso. And Amanda and I get to hang out on the couch and just have some takeout together. And it starts this 24-hour period where we're just going to enjoy God together. And we actually enter into a Sabbath, enter into a 24-hour period where we're going to stop all of the work we get paid for and all the work we don't get paid for, and we're going to enjoy the things along the way. And so eating well is something that we do. And then lastly, another guideline we have is just get outside the house. And we've got young kids. Many of you have young kids right now as well. And we get outside the house as a family. That's something that doesn't have to be really major. We could just go for a walk. We might go for a hike, we might go to a park, but we get outside the house. And then the other piece of that is I get outside the house by myself for a little bit, and then my wife gets outside the house by herself for a little bit. And what are we doing with that time? We're doing things that bring us life. We're enjoying gifts of God that help remind us who he is. It helps remind us of our limits and restores our soul because we remember our true identity. It helps us to stop striving so we can be restored. So you hear all that and you go, I don't even know where to start. How do I even get going with this idea? This is so unusual and foreign, and I get that. This is extremely foreign to us. We don't understand the necessity of stopping like this, but it is a necessity. So here's just some things to get you started. Number one is you need to make the time. You need to make the time. This is going to require you to say no to some things. And you know what? You might not need to start with 24 hours. Can you start with 4 hours? Can you start with an afternoon or a morning, and then that can grow to 6 hours or 8 hours and eventually a full day? So you need to make the time. Number two, you need to prepare to rest. This sounds really kind of counterintuitive, but if you were right now, if someone were to give you the day off tomorrow, would you know how you would use it and how that would restore your soul? I would venture to say for many of us, we wouldn't. So we need to take some time and think about, God, what are some of the things you've provided me that really give me life? And prioritize your day with those things. So prepare to rest. And then lastly, enter his rest. And what I mean by that is it's okay to give yourself permission to rest. Give yourself permission to stop. This is something God initiated, something God introduced to his people a long time ago that he invites us into. This is the invitation by him, not a command. He invites us into this. So you hear all that and you're going, yeah, I don't want to do any of that. I understand. It's not easy. But before you write all this off and before you stop listening for good, let me just ask you one more thing. Isn't it true that when we feel squeezed by life, the things that we push out first are the things we value the most? Isn't that true? I mean, when life gets chaotic, when our schedule gets so full, we don't know when we would add anything else. Isn't the first thing that we kind of push to the sidelines are the things that we value the most? It's our faith, it's our marriage, our relationship with our kids, relationship with authentic community and friendships. Those get pushed out. And I'm just saying, hey, wouldn't it make sense to take one day out of your schedule, one day out of your week, and prioritize those things? And if we do that, I think what we'll start to see is that we have a shepherd whose presence among us and around us and in us as we are having a relationship with him. He's the one that removes that fear, that tension, that aggravation, the hunger that we have. And it's his presence that restores us, that gives us rest. I believe you can do this. And as you do, I think we'll start to take a few steps back from the ledge. And maybe we won't be living in so much of a burnout society anymore. Let me pray for you. Father, we just want to say that there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do on our own to actually rest in the way that we need to. Left to ourselves, we're going to mess it up. We're going to fill it with things that just bring relief. We're going to fill that time with things that are just a break from our chaotic life, and it's not going to have any long-term change. But you, Jesus, the Good Shepherd, through your presence, you're the one that removes all of that for us and allows us to lie down and to experience restoration on a level that maybe we've never felt before. And so I pray that we'd all have the courage to take some kind of baby step towards this, whether it's a few hours or half a day or a full day during our week, where we can Sabbath and stop from the work that we get paid to do and the work we don't get paid to do. Because as we do that, you restore us as only you can. In your name we pray, amen.